All right, so remember this is the last lecture before your next exam. So next week will be your next exam. Just again, reminder, complete it by Friday at midnight. Okay. And if you happen to have technological issues, remember I need some form of documentation, whether it be a photo or whatnot. Okay, so looking at acid base homeostasis, it's kind of the words you hear: fluid, body fluid, water fluid, the electrolytes in your system. And basically, the entire form of homeostasis is just it's our maintenance of that fluid volume. And as such, as the volume changes, our electrolyte composition changes as well. And as we've seen before, a lot of biological processes make hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions, so can make it acidic or can make it basic. So this entire process of fluid volume change, electrolyte composition, is what promotes that acid-base balance and keeps us functioning in a normal manner. Okay. And the kidneys play a huge central role in doing this all. Okay. And it works in conjunction with almost every system, especially the large ones: respiratory, cardiovascular, and endocrine systems. So when you hear body fluid, one of the first things you might hear is total body water, or sometimes referred to as body water. And that is exactly as it sounds. Okay, it's the total amount of water within our body. So it really accounts for a lot of our mass. Okay, so it's about 60% of your body's mass in adult males and 55% in adult females. Now, as you can see, that percentage varies between both. So our body water, total body water, can vary by age, sex, body composition, disease state. Okay, so total body water is not just one number versus the other. Okay, it's varies in certain situations. And with that total body water, it's not just all in one area, it's distributed across our body. So we have a distribution of our bodily fluids, and they're divided into two major compartments. Okay, our intracellular fluid, also known as ICF, that is located within cells. Okay, the cytosol of cells. That's about 2/3 of the total body water in your body. The other is extracellular fluid, or ECF. That's about 1/3 of your total body water, and that's even actually further subdivided: interstitial fluid, blood plasma, your other ones we've talked about, like lymph fluids, cerebrospinal fluid, other types of fluids make this up. The most common one with the ECF, though, is interstitial fluid. It's about 80%, with the rest of it falling up being majorly blood plasma and then those other fluids. There it goes. All right. So looking at this, I guess, as a more diagram. Okay, so we know that body fluid is just a substance that's most commonly liquid. Okay, and it's produced by our body, and it consists of water as well as those dissolved solids. So don't forget about electrolytes. Okay. And like we said, if you are an adult, your bodily fluid on your left hand side is usually about 55%, 60% if male. Okay, that's the blue line on your left hand side. And they are present in those two main compartments, because inside cells, outside cells. So that's what you see here as your intracellular fluid and your extracellular fluid on the center there, showing the variation between those fluids that we have. Okay, so remember, intracellular within cells, within the cytosol, and that other extracellular fluid outside of cells. That's all the other body fluids that's outside of the cell. Okay, and ECF, it's interstitial fluid, which is that 80%, that occupies microscopic spaces between our tissues. Whereas the 20% of the ECF is also blood plasma. Okay, the plasma that's circulating within our body. Other those extracellular fluids that we've talked about, they're grouped within interstitial fluid. So remember, that's like your lymph plasma, that's inside your lymphatic vessels. That's your cerebral spinal fluid that's in the nervous system, your synovial fluid, which is in your joints, aqueous humor and vitreous that's in your eyes. Okay, endolymph, paralymph in the ears. And you're starting to get a big picture here that there's a lot of fluids within our body and a lot that are distributed across our body. And so when it comes to these guys, we have to kind of keep them separated, right? And so there's two general barriers that separate intracellular fluid and interstitial fluid with blood plasma as well. And one is the plasma membrane of individual cells. Okay, that will obviously separate intracellular fluid from whatever the surrounding interstitial fluid is. So if you remember probably in your previous semester, okay, that the plasma membrane, it's quite a selective permeable barrier. So it allows some of our substances to cross, but it blocks the movement of other substances. Now, sometimes we got active transport, okay, which we see when it comes to fluid balance really helps with our electrolytes. Okay, so that's one of our barriers. And then the next is the blood vessel walls. This divides interstitial fluid from blood plasma, and it's only in capillaries where the smallest blood vessels in the walls that are thin enough to cause this leakiness, allowing to permit exchanges of water and solutes between the blood plasma and interstitial fluid. So these two barriers are what help it separate extracellular and intracellular, and then even further into our extracellular, separate blood plasma from what's left. So our body is in fluid balance when our required amounts of water and solids are present and are correctly proportioned with the various compartments. So water is by far the largest component of the body. That's like we showed prior, it's anywhere from 45 to 75% of our total body mass. Again, that depends on various things. Okay, for instance, obese people have a proportionally less water than someone that is leaner. And that's because water comprises less than 20% of the mass of adipose tissue or fat tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, however, that's about 65% water. So when we look not just at tissue, we can look at different times of life. You know, we have infants that actually have the highest percentage of water. They have up to 75% of the body mass is water. So it's again, this fluid balance, this percentage of water really is impacted even just by what point of development we're at. Now, the process of filtration, reabsorption, diffusion, and osmosis, it allows for us to continual exchange of water and solids among our body fluid compartments. But the volume of fluid in each compartment remains pretty stable, and the pressures that promote filtration of blood or fluid from blood capillaries and reabsorption of fluid back into capillaries really is led by osmosis. Okay, that's the primary means of water movement between this intracellular and interstitial fluid. And that really is there to help with the concentration of solids and both those fluids, actually, which of course will determine how water's going to flow, how's it going to move. And that's all because most solids in the body are electrolytes. Remember, electrolytes are these inorganic compounds that dissociate into our ions, and fluid balance is closely related to those, what is known as electrolyte balance. So, because intake of water and electrolytes really rarely occurs in exactly the same proportions as their presence in the bodily fluids, the ability of the kidneys to excrete excess water by producing that diluted urine or to excrete excess electrolytes, that's your concentrated urine that we discussed. It's really extremely important in the maintenance of our homeostasis, not just with fluid balance, but also with solids. So, The body can gain water by ingestion, okay, and metabolic synthesis. So obviously our main source of body water is ingested. Okay, if we get liquids, water, if we get moist foods, that obviously the moist, they're gonna have some substance of water within it. But it's all absorbed from the digestive canal, and that's about 2,300 milliliters per day that comes from your digestive canal. The other source of the water is metabolic water. That water is produced in the body mainly when electrons are accepted by oxygen as we undergo aerobic respiration, and to an even smaller extent during dehydration synthesis reactions within our body. Metabolic water accounts for only like 200 milliliters per day compared to the tons we absorb just from drinking or eating water. And so that totals per day 2,500. Normally, body fluid volume remains pretty constant. Okay, obviously, it's homeostasis is quite important. So it's because water loss equals water gain. And water loss can occur in four ways. And each day your kidneys they go and excrete about 1,500 milliliters in urine, but also you evaporate it in your skin. That's about 600 milliliters. That's like your sweat evaporating in the heat. I'm sure if any of you take classes in Latin, you know it's there. Your lungs actually exhale water. It's water vapor. It's about 300 milliliters. Our digestive canal it eliminates about 100 milliliters that go through our feces. And women that are at the reproductive day stage, additional water is actually lost when they go through the menstrual flow. So on average, our daily water loss it's about 2,500 milliliters. The amount of water lost by a given route, however, can vary over time. Okay, so for instance, water can literally pour from skin in the form of sweat during exercise or exertion. But in other cases, water may be lost in diarrhea during a digestive canal infection. So it's really impacted by our environment, age, temperature for obvious reasons. But there's this constant battle between water gain and water loss. So obviously, we need to regulate this, right? We need to be able to counteract if we're dehydrated, if we're not consuming enough water, but we also need to be able to keep water in. All right, so we have to regulate this in somehow, and we have four main ways we do that. It's the thirst mechanism, antidiuretic hormones, aldosterone, and atrial natriuretic peptide or ANP. So the volume of metabolic water that's formed in the body, it's going to depend entirely on the level of aerobic respiration that's occurring. So they're reflecting the demand for our ATP in our cells. And obviously, when more ATP is produced, more water is formed. Body water gain is regulated mainly by the volume of water intake or how much fluid we're going to go ahead and drink. An area in the hypothalamus that is known as the thirst center is what governs our urge to drink, to hence your thirst mechanism. So when water loss is greater than water gain, so like dehydration, a decrease in volume and as such an increase in osmolarity of the body fluid occurs. A decrease in the blood volume causes blood pressure to fall and increased activity from osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, which becomes triggered by an increased blood osmolarity in the process. And that all together goes and stimulates our thirst center in the hypothalamus. Now, other signals that can stimulate this are our volume receptors in the atria that are there to detect the decrease in blood volume. We have baroreceptors that are in our blood vessels that detect if we have a decrease in our blood pressure. And angiotensin 2, that's normally formed during the activation of the renin angiotensin aldosterone pathway, decreases the blood pressure. And lastly, neurons. So neurons in our mouth will detect dryness. Okay, and that's all because of decreased flow of saliva. So as a result, all of these can also stimulate the sensation of thirst. Okay, so we get an increase in our desire to want to drink water, drink some type of fluid. And of course, that's going to lead to an increased fluid intake. Okay, and if we're increasing more fluids, then we're going to restore that fluid volume. So overall fluid gain balances fluid loss. However, the sensation of thirst does not occur quickly enough, or access to fluid is restricted. So, you're out in the desert, you're dehydrated, there's no water, and significant dehydration goes and occurs. This also, besides the desert, can often affect elderly people, okay, as well as some infants. So, when we have heavy sweating or fluid loss from diarrhea or vomiting that is occurring, that is why they tell you you should start drinking fluids. This is why they tell you to go to get some Pedialyte, things like that. It's because eventually, if not controlled, you're going to have a rapid loss of water, body volume, which is going to impact obviously a lot of your bodily functions. So this is how we get our first kind of way of controlling it, the thirst response. So even though the loss of water through sweating and exhalation increases during we're exercising, elimination of excess body water solutes occurs mainly by control of the loss in urine. The extent of urinary salt, so NaCl, salt loss, is the main factor that determines our body fluid volume. And the reason for this is because water follows solutes and osmosis into the two main solutes in electrocellular fluid and also in our urine. They're the sodium ions and chloride ions. So, in a similar way, the main factor that determines body fluid osmolarity is the extent of how much water we're losing and we go in the restroom, our urinary water loss. Now, the major hormones that help to regulate water loss is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, which we've discussed prior. And this hormone, it's a vasopressin, and it's produced by neurosecretory cells in our hypothalamus. And that does go and get stored on our posterior pituitary gland. But when the osmolarity of body fluids increases, osmoreceptors in our hypothalamus stimulate the thirst, which we just discussed, but they also increase the synthesis and release of ADH. ADH goes and it promotes insertion of water channel proteins, okay, those are those aquaporins, into the apical membranes of principal cells in the late distal tubules and collecting ducts of the kidneys. So as a result of this all occurring, the permeability of these cells to water increases. Water molecules move by osmosis from the renal tubular fluid into the cells and then from the cells into the bloodstream. So this results in a decrease in blood osmolarity and an increase in blood volume and blood pressure and the production of small volume of concentrated urine. And once the body, however, has adequate water or enough water, the ADH level in the bloodstream decreases. So as the amount of ADH in the blood goes down or declines, some of the aquaporin channels are removed from the membrane because we no longer need them, right? So they're removed via endocytosis. So as a result, water permeability of those principal cells decreases and more water is lost in the urine. Okay, so it's starting to have a role in concentration of urine. Now, factors other than blood osmolarity influence how secretion of ADH is going to occur. So, a decrease in blood volume or blood pressure can go and actually stimulate the ADH being released. Atrial volume receptors can detect the decrease in blood volume, and baroreceptors in blood vessels detect the decrease in blood pressure. So, ADH release is stimulated also by factors that are unrelated to water balance at all. So, like, it can go even further. We can get pain, nausea, stress can also stimulate this. And secretion of ADH, however, can also be inhibited. Obviously, if we have something that is, you know, important, either our body itself as a feedback is going to be able to inhibit it, or sometimes environmental cues can inhibit it, like alcohol. So, if consumption of alcoholic beverage actually promotes large amounts of urine and the secretion of ADH. Okay, so that's why if those are over the age of 21 are drinking, most commonly they're associated with having to go to the bathroom a little more often. It's because of the secretion of ADH. So now there's two key hormones that also play another role. Well, third, two more, I should say. One is aldosterone. Okay, so when there is a decrease in blood pressure, obviously it's going to occur in response to a decrease in blood volume or a deficiency of sodium in the plasma, the kidneys release renin. That goes and activates the renin angiotensin aldosterone pathway. Once aldosterone is formed, it increases sodium reabsorption in the late distal tubules in our collecting ducts of the kidney, and that relieves the sodium deficiency in the plasma. Because the antidiuretic hormone is also released when blood pressure is low, water reabsorption accompanies sodium reabsorption via osmosis. So they're traveling together because of these two guys. And so that's going to conserve the volume of blood fluid or body fluids by reducing urinary loss of water. Okay, so they kind of work hand in hand with one another, promoting the osmosis flow of water as well as sodium. Now, atrial natriuretic peptides or ANPs, they an increase in blood volume. Okay, so that might occur when you finish one or more supersized drinks, energy drinks. I'm sure you're all drinking. It stretches the atria of the heart and promotes release of that ANP. So ANP goes and it promotes what is known as natriuresis, and that's elevated excretion of sodium into our urine. The osmotic consequence of excreting more sodium, however, is loss of more water in our urine, which that consequently goes and it decreases blood volume and pressure. And so, in addition to stimulating the release of ANP, an increase in blood volume also shows the release of renin from the kidneys. And when the renin level declines, less aldosterone is formed, which causes reabsorption of filtered sodium to slow in the late distal tubules and collecting ducts of our kidneys. So you'll start to realize these distal tubules and collecting ducts really do have a huge role in this homeostasis. So in the process of this filtered, slow sodium reabsorption, the more filtered sodium in water, because of osmosis, of course, remains in our tubular fluid, and that is what then gets excreted in the urine. So normally the cells of the body, they don't shriek or swell because of extracellular fluid that surrounds them if it's isotonic. So what that means is the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid have the same osmolarity. Now, changes in the osmolarity, however, of that extracellular fluid, they can cause fluid imbalances. So if extracellular fluid becomes hypertonic, so it has a greater concentration of whatever solute than the intracellular fluid, water moves from cells into the extracellular fluid by osmosis. So it causes the cells to shrink. If extracellular fluid becomes hypotonic, however, so it has a lower concentration of solutes in the intracellular fluid, water moves from that extracellular fluid into the cells again by osmosis, and this time the cells are going to swell. So changes in osmolarity most often result from changes in concentrations of sodium and chloride. It's the major contributors to osmolarity of extracellular fluid, and as such, it's going to affect if they're swelling or not swelling. And an increase in the osmolarity of extracellular fluid can occur. For example, you go and you eat a salty meal. Increased intake of the sodium chloride produces an increase in the levels of sodium and chloride ions in extracellular fluid. So because of that, the osmolarity of extracellular fluid increases, and that causes net movement of water from cells into extracellular fluid. So water movement shrinks the cells of the body. Now, if neurons of the brain remain in this state for a super long period of time, you get confused, you can even have convulsions, coma, and sometimes even death if it's severe. Body cells, however, usually shrink only slightly and only for a short duration in response to an increase in osmolarity of extracellular fluid. And that's because we have corrective measures, like our thirst mechanism. We eat salty food, all of a sudden we need water. Our mouth's dry, so our thirst mechanism hits. Or we have the ADH, which increases the amount of body water. So we have ways to fight this. Now, on the flip side, a decrease in the osmolarity of extracellular fluid can also occur. So if you go and drink a large volume of water, It causes the dilution of the levels of sodium and chloride in our extracellular fluid, so it falls below the normal range. And when the extracellular concentrations of those guys decrease, the osmolarity of extracellular fluid decreases alongside. So the result is movement of water from our extracellular fluid into the cells, which causes our cells to swell. Now, when the osmolarity of extracellular fluid decreases, secretion of ADH is inhibited and the kidneys excrete a large volume of diluted urine. And that's usually what helps to restore the osmolarity of the body fluids. So as a result of all this, body cells swell only slightly, only for a brief period, because we have, again, a mechanism of kind of combating, keeping that homeostasis there. But of course, it's not all safe. And if you have someone that just steadily consumes water faster than their kidneys can excrete it, or when renal function is poor, for instance, the result may be water intoxication. Okay, and that's just a state in which excessive body water causes your cells to swell dangerously. And as is the case when neurons of the brain shrink, swelling of the brain's neurons can result in that confusions, convulsions, and possible death. Okay, so prevent dire sequence of events in cases of severe electrolyte and water loss. Solutions given either via IV or oral include a small amount of table salt. Okay, so to kind of prevent these large things happen, but obviously our bodies have these adaptive methods to kind of help control it all. So I keep talking about electrolytes, right? So electrolytes are ions just formed when electrolytes dissolve. Okay, we have ions in our system. Okay, and that's formed from electrolytes. And they have some important functions. Okay, so first, they are largely confined to particular fluid compartments and are definitely more numerous than anything that's non-electrolyte. So they can go forth and they can help control the osmosis of water between our compartments. They can help maintain an acid-base balance required for normal cellular activities. They carry an electrical current, which hence, ions positive or negative charge, but they can carry an electrical current with it, and that allows production of our action potentials and gradient potentials of our neurons firing. And several ions serve as cofactors, which are actually needed for our enzymes in our body to go forth. Okay, and the most common ones, well, major ones: sodium, potassium, chloride, bicarbonate, calcium, phosphate, and magnesium. I'm sure if any of you have seen an IV bag or taken a lot of um, electrolyte solutions, Pedialyte, for instance, you'll see these all labeled on there as well. With anything, we have to be able to compare across the board, right? And with electrolytes, it's even a little harder because we have anions, we have cations, we have some that are negative charge, we have some that are positive charge. Okay, so because of this, they get a specific unit, milliequivalents per liter. And these units go and they give the concentration of cations or anions in whatever given volume of the solution there is. And one equivalent is positive or negative charge equals the amount of charge in 1 mole of a hydrogen ion. So if you remember, a mole is just a substance that its molecular weight is expressed in grams. So for looking at these electrolytes, we got sodium, potassium, bicarbonate. They all have a single positive or negative charge. So the number of their milli equivalents per liter is equal to the number of millimolars per liter. For ions, like your calcium, your phosphate, they have 2 positive or 2 negative charge. So they're just doubled. Okay, they're twice as the number of the millimolars per liter. This figure helps you to kind of understand that all solute concentrations are not created equal across our fluids. Okay, looking at these 3 fluids, our blood plasma, our interstitial fluid, and our intracellular fluid, we see there's quite a difference. Okay, especially if you're looking at blood plasma, which contains many protein anions, whereas interstitial fluid has very few. And that's all because normal capillary membranes are pretty much impermeable to proteins, and only a few plasma proteins go and they leak out of blood vessels into interstitial fluid. So this difference in protein concentration, that's largely responsible actually for blood colloid osmotic pressure that's exerted by blood plasma. From the previous slide, we see electrolyte content, it differs from intracellular to extracellular. However, each have their most abundant cation and anion. For extracellular, it's sodium as its most abundant cation, chloride as its most abundant anion. In our intracellular fluid, the most abundant cation is potassium. Most abundant anions are proteins and phosphates. And this kind of abundant in different cations and everything, that's actually led by a specific pump. So what occurs is we have active transportation with sodium and potassium, specifically sodium going out of a cell and potassium going into a cell. It's called sodium potassium pumps. These guys are doing their job, pumping sodium potassium either way. And so in the process of doing this, they're actually maintaining a high intracellular concentration of potassium and a high extracellular concentration of sodium because of their swapping. Now, looking at each one individually, though, sodium ions, like we said, they're the most abundant ions in extracellular fluid. That's like 90% of extracellular cations you have. And normal blood plasma, for instance, is 136 to 148 milliequivalents per liter. It's a lot. So, as we have already learned, all right, sodium plays a pivotal role in fluid and electrolyte balance because that's going to account for almost half of the osmolarity of extracellular fluid. The flow of sodium through voltage-gated channels in our plasma membrane of our cells is also necessary for generation and conduction of our action potentials and neurons and actually your muscle fibers. Now, typical daily intake of this is it's often far exceeds the body's normal daily requirements. Okay, and it's all because of our excess dietary salt. We're eating a crap ton more salt than we used to eat. Okay, so the kidneys excrete excess sodium, but they also go and conserve it during periods of shortage, all because of this. But again, we have an extremely high obsession with salt, which can impact these levels. The sodium level in the blood is controlled by that aldosterone, the ADH, and the AMP. Aldosterone increases renal absorption of the sodium. When blood plasma concentration of sodium drops below a certain region, we have a condition, however, called hyponatremia. That's when ADH release stops. Okay, so it's there to help, but it also gets to a negative feedback point where it stops. And the lack of ADH in turn, it's actually going to permit greater excretion of water and urine and restores the normal sodium levels in our ECF. AMP increases sodium excretion by the kidneys when the sodium levels are above normal condition. Potassium ions, they are the most abundant cations in cellular fluid, right? And as such, they play a key role in establishing what is known as our resting membrane potential and the repolarization phase of action potentials in neurons and our muscle fibers. And it also helps to maintain normal intracellular fluid volume. So when potassium moves into or out of our cells, it is often exchanged for hydrogen ions. So it also helps to regulate the pH of our bodily fluids and our cells as well. So the normal concentration of plasma potassium is quite lower than our sodium, about 3.5, and is controlled mainly by aldosterone, whereas sodium is controlled by several, mostly aldosterone does the job here of potassium. When blood plasma potassium concentrations are high, there's more aldosterone being secreted into the blood. Aldosterone then stimulates principal cells of the renal collecting ducts to secrete more potassium, so excess potassium is lost in the urine. Now, when plasma potassium concentration is low, aldosterone secretion decreases and less potassium is excreted in urine. Because potassium is needed during the repolarization phase of nerve impulses, unfortunately, we can get some issues if we don't have the right amount of potassium. So if we have abnormal potassium levels, we can have what is known as hyperkalemia, so above normal concentration, and that can cause cell death due to ventricular fibrillation with the changes of repolarization. Chloride ions, those are the most prevalent anions in extracellular fluid. Okay, so normal blood plasma has a concentration around 95 to 105 milliequivalents per liter. Chloride moves relatively easily between extracellular and intracellular compartments, and that's because most plasma membranes contain many little leakage channels that chloride ions can go through. But it also has what are known as antiporters. So for this reason, chloride can actually help balance the level of anions in different fluid compartments. One example of that is that a chloride shift that occurs between red blood cells and blood plasma as the blood level of carbon dioxide either increases or decreases. And in this case, antiporter begins to exchange chlorides from bicarbonate ion. This maintains a correct balance of anions between both of those fluids. It kind of switching out, I guess you could say. Chloride ions are also part of the hydrochloric secreted into gastric juice. ADH helps to regulate that balance, specifically in bodily fluids, because it governs that extent of water loss in urine. Processes that increase or decrease renal reabsorption of sodium ions also affect the reabsorption of chloride ions. So that is, if you think about the reabsorption of sodium and chloride is occurring by means of those symporters with sodium and chloride together. So they're both a little dependent on one another when it comes to exchange. Bicarbonate ions, they are the second most prevalent extracellular anion. So we have about 22, 26 milliequivalent liters in our systemic arterial blood. And it does vary in different regions. So if we have in our systemic venous blood, that's 23, 27. So it's not all created equal depending on location. Now, this bicarbonate concentration increases as blood flows through systemic capillaries, and it's because the carbon dioxide released by our metabolically active cells combines with water to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid is then what breaks apart and it makes the hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate ion. So as blood flows through pulmonary capillaries, however, concentration of bicarbonate ion decreases as carbon dioxide is exhaled. Intracellular fluid also contains a small amount of that bicarbonate ion, and as previously noted, the exchange of chloride for bicarbonate ion helps to maintain that correct balance of anions in both fluid departments, actually. And kidneys are the main regulators of this blood bicarbonate ion concentration. So the intercalated cells of our renal tubules in the kidneys, they either form bicarbonate ion and release it into the blood where the blood level is low, or they excrete the excess bicarbonate ion into our urine, okay, when that level in our body is too high. So changes in the blood level of bicarbonate ion are considered later in this chapter when we get to it, but so just keep an eye out for that in a couple slides. Calcium, because such a large amount of calcium is stored in bone, it is basically the most abundant mineral in the body. It's more so a mineral. So about 98% of the calcium in us as adults is located in skeleton and teeth. It is combined with phosphates to form a crystal lattice of mineral salts. In body fluids, that calcium is mainly an extracellular cation. And the normal concentration of free or unattached calcium in blood plasma is 4.5 milliequivalents. So we're starting to decrease in our concentration as we go down. About the same amount of calcium is attached to various plasma proteins. So we have some that are free, unattached, circulating blood. Some of them are also there, but they're actually attached. Okay, so it's not just solely floating by themselves. Besides contributing to the hardness of bones and teeth, obviously by forming those crystals, calcium plays important roles in blood clotting. neurotransmitter release, maintenance of our muscle tone, excitability of our nervous muscle tissues that helps with contraction of your skeletal muscles. But the most important regulator of this all, which affects it, is actually our parathyroid hormone, our PTH. A low level of calcium in blood plasma promotes the release of PTH, which stimulates osteoclast in the bone tissue to release calcium and phosphate a little bit, but it's point calcium. And that comes from the bone's extracellular matrix. So PTH increases bone reabsorption as a result. Parathyroid hormone also enhances reabsorption of calcium from our glomerular filtrate through the renal tubule cells and back into blood, and increases production of calcitrol, which is a form of vitamin D that's activated. It acts as a hormone, which in turn increases calcium absorption from food in the digestive canal. So if you remember, calcitonin, or CT, is produced by the thyroid gland. It inhibits the activity of osteoclasts, and it accelerates that calcium deposition into bones, and that can then actually lower blood calcium levels, so it can act as a response to over the top calcium blood levels. Phosphates, so about 85% of the phosphate in us, it's present as calcium phosphate salts. These are structural components of our bone and our teeth, so similar to what we saw with the calcium. The remaining 15% of us, that's ionized. And we have 3 different phosphate ions, all depending on structure. And they're all important for intracellular anion function. So at the normal pH of bodily fluids, HPO4 2, or negative 2, that's the most prevalent form. And phosphates contribute about 100 milliequivalents of the anions in our intracellular fluid. Now, the HPO4 is an important buffer of hydrogen ions in our bodily fluids as well as in our urine. So, as such, you'd expect it's going to help and control pH. Now, although some are free, most phosphate ions are covalently bound to other organic molecules like lipids. That's where we get our phospholipids, but they can also go and bind the proteins, nucleic acids, actually ATP, which already has some phosphates. The normal blood plasma concentration of those ionized phosphates, that's only about 1.7 milliequivalents. The same 2 hormones that govern that calcium homeostasis, parathyroid hormone and calcitrol, they also regulate the levels of these phosphates ions in the blood plasma. Parathyroid hormone stimulates reabsorption of bone extracellular matrix by the osteoclast that releases phosphate and the calcium ions into the bloodstream and the kidneys. And parathyroid hormone inhibits reabsorption of phosphate ions while stimulating reabsorption of calcium ions by renal tubular cells. So it's kind of doing exactly what it did with the calcium. It's just as the calcium is getting regulated, potassium or phosphate is also being regulated. So basically, parathyroid hormone increases urinary excretion of phosphate and lowers blood phosphate groups. Calcitrol promotes absorption of both phosphates and calcium from our digestive canal. And fibroblast growth factor 23, or FGF23, which is a polypeptide paracrine, okay, so it's a local hormone, it does its job in a local area of our body, also helps to regulate blood plasma levels of phosphate. The hormone decreases the blood levels, the phosphate blood levels, by increasing its excretion by the kidneys. That, of course, is going to lead to us decrease absorption of the phosphates by our digestive canal. Lastly, magnesium. Okay, that's about, in us adults, 54% of the total body magnesium is part of our bone matrix. You're starting to see something very similar, right? A lot of them are associated with the skeletal system. So out of that 54, the remaining 46%, that is magnesium ions in our intracellular fluid, but also our extracellular fluids. It's just more prevalent in our intracellular. Magnesium ions, they are the second most common intracellular cation. And so functionally, it acts as a cofactor for a lot of enzymes. So a lot of enzymes that are needed for the metabolism of carbohydrates, proteins, also sodium potassium pumps. So it's essential for normal neuromuscular activity, our sympathetic transmissions, our myocardial functioning, and in addition to all that, secretion of parathyroid hormone actually depends on it. So we have this hormone that controls a lot of the other electrolytes functions, but this hormone being secreted actually depends on an electrolyte. So if we're looking at our normal blood plasma, this guy's pretty low. Okay, you've heard the hundreds, you've heard the 40s and the 30s. This one only has 1.3 milliequivalents. And several factors regulate the blood plasma level of magnesium by varying the rate of which it's going to be excreted in our urine. The kidneys increase urinary excretion of magnesium in response to what is known as hypercalcemia and hypermagnesemia, and increases in extracellular fluid volume, which leads subsequently to a decrease in parathyroid hormone and acidosis, whereas the opposite conditions occurred and promote decrease in renal excretion of magnesium. Okay, so ions, super important. Okay, they play a lot of different roles to help maintain our homeostasis. And a major homeostatic challenge is actually keeping hydrogen ion concentration, or the pH, of our bodily fluids at an appropriate level. So this task is actually what is known as acid-base balance, and it's super critical for our cellular functions. So as an example, three-dimensional shape of all body proteins that enables them to perform specific functions, okay, is very sensitive to pH changes. So when the diet contains a large amount of protein, as is typical in our diets, cellular metabolism produces more acids than bases. That acidifies our blood. But before proceeding, okay, we have to review exactly what are acids, what are bases, what are pH, especially in the line of our bodies. So, in a healthy person, several mechanisms are going to help maintain our pH of systemic arterial blood. That's normally between 7.35 7.45. Now, this is all dependent on the hydrogen ion concentrations. And if you remember way back, if you have an increased hydrogen ion concentration, you're going to lead to a more acidic solution. Whereas on the flip side, if you had a hydroxide ion and it's increased in its concentration, or for instance, it could be a bicarbonate ion also, it will turn it more basic. Okay, so because metabolic reactions often themselves are going to produce a huge excess of the hydrogen ions, the lack of any mechanism for getting rid of this would cause hydrogen ions and body fluids to rise quickly to a pretty lethal level. Homeostasis of hydrogen ion concentration within a narrow range is then essential, obviously, for us to survive. And it's pretty important for elimination from the body, and it's done by these three large major mechanisms: buffer systems, respiratory regulation, and renal regulation. Buffer systems, they act pretty quickly, okay, to temporarily bind hydrogen ions, removing highly reactive excess hydrogen ions from solution. And buffers then go and they raise the pH of our body fluids, but they don't actually remove the hydrogen ions from the body. Okay. So the next is our exhalation, actually. And that's what is known as respiratory regulation. Okay. And now, us exhaling carbon dioxide, and thus by increasing our rate and depth of breathing, get more carbon dioxide exhaled. What occurs is within just minutes, the reduction level of carbonic acid in our blood, and that then raises the blood pH because it actually goes, carbonic acid is formed, and as it's forming, it's taking hydrogen ions out of our blood, which leads to a reduction of blood hydrogen ion levels. So our pH goes down. And of course, as we've seen so far, kidneys are super important. So we have a renal regulation. And basically, it's kidneys just excrete hydrogen ions. It's really the slowest mechanism, but it's the only way to eliminate acids other than that carbonic acid through the excretion in urine. Okay, so whereas buffer systems don't really get rid of hydrogen ions, respiratory and renal do. They just do it in different forms: urine, breath. Getting into the buffer systems a little more, most buffer systems in our body consist of a weak acid and the salt of that acid, which functions as a weak base. Buffers prevent that super rapid drastic change of the pH of body fluids, and it's all by that converting of a strong acid and base into a weak acid and weak base within basically just a second. Strong acids lower the pH more than weak acids because strong acids actually release hydrogen ions more readily and thus contribute more free hydrogen ions. So strong bases also can lead to a strong impact by raising pH more than our weak ones do. Now, the principal buffer system of our bodies, they are protein buffer system, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, and the phosphate buffer system. So three different key systems that help with this. Protein buffer system is the most abundant in extracellular fluid and blood plasma specifically. So to give an example, protein hemoglobin is an especially good buffer within red blood cells. The albumin is the main protein buffer in blood plasma. And proteins are composed of those amino acids, organic molecules, and they all have at least one carboxyl group and at least one amino group. These then are the groups that are functional components of this protein buffer system. The free carboxyl group at one end of the protein acts like an acid by releasing hydrogen ion when pH rises. The hydrogen ion is then able to react with an excess hydroxide ion in whatever solution to form water. And the free amino group at the other end of a protein can act as a base by combining with hydrogen ions when pH falls. So proteins can then buffer both acids and bases in addition to the terminal carboxyl and amino groups. Whatever side chains can help too. Okay, they can buffer hydrogen ions. Present is about 7 of the 20 amino acids can really help do this. Okay, so we talked about the protein hemoglobin, how it's an important buffer of hydrogen ions in red blood cells, and how that is as blood flows through our capillaries, carbon dioxide passes from tissue cells into red blood cells, and then it combines with water, and that forms carbonic acid. Once formed, that carbonic acid, it breaks apart into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. But at the same time, that CO2 is entering red blood, oxyhemoglobin is giving up its oxygen to tissue cells. Reduced hemoglobin picks up most of the hydrogen ion. And so for this reason, reduced hemoglobin usually is written as HbH, which I know we've seen it in the previous lecture. It's when it's oxalated, hemoglobin is written as Hb-O2. And lastly, this kind of ties in with our carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. Right? And this system is actually based solely on that bicarbonate ion. And it is actually its weak base. And of course, carbonic acid acts as a weak acid. Okay, so we've right there with just occurring in the blood system, we've basically made a buffer system out of these two. So bicarbonate ion we know is a significant anion in both intracellular and extracellular fluids. And because the kidneys also synthesize new bicarbonate and reabsorb filtered bicarbonate, this buffer is important. It's really not lost in the urine. If there is any excess of hydrogen ion, bicarbonate ion can function as a weak base, and it removes the excess hydrogen ion. And what happens is as that acid, carbonic acid dissociates into water and carbon dioxide, and our CO2 is exhaled from the lungs, there is a shortage of hydrogen ions. The bicarbonate or carbonic acid functions as a weak acid and provides a hydrogen ion. So at a pH of about 7.4, this bicarbonate ion is about 24 milliequivalents. Our carbonic acid is about 1.2. So bicarbonate ions outnumber carbonic acid by like 20 to 1. Right? It's because CO2 and H2O combine to form bicarbonic acid. This buffer system cannot protect against pH changes due to respiratory problems. It makes sense, right? We can't exhale CO2. We have either a lot of CO2 or a shortage of CO2, and since CO2 is that main player, this can strongly impact how this buffer system works, and as such can affect to lead to the pH changes within the body. The third one is the phosphate buffer system. This guy acts by mechanisms very similar to the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. The components of this phosphate buffer system are the ions dihydrogen phosphate and monohydrogen phosphate. So phosphates, remember, are major anion in intracellular fluids, but minor ones in our extracellular fluids. The dihydrogen phosphate ion acts as our weak acid, and it's capable of buffering strong bases, such as our hydroxide ion. And the monohydrogen phosphate ion is capable of buffering the hydrogen ion released by strong acids, such as like you have a hydrochloric acid and releases this hydrogen ion. And it's all because it acts as a weak base. And because the concentration of phosphates is the highest in intracellular fluid, the phosphate buffer system is an important regulator of pH in the cytosol. It also acts to a smaller degree in extracellular fluids and buffer acids in urine. And this H2PO4, or the dihydrogen phosphate, is formed when excess hydrogen in the kidney tubular fluid combines with HbO4 The hydrogen ion that becomes part of it, okay, passes into the urine. So this reaction is the only way the kidneys help maintain blood pH by excreting hydrogen in the urine. Okay, so protein buffer system, the hydrogen ion's still there. Okay, it becomes a part of whatever organic molecule is being produced. The next, carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, that's respiratory system. They're associated with CO2 in our respiratory system. Lastly, the phosphate buffer system is the only one that we excrete the hydrogen ion through urine. Okay, so big key player with the renal system. The CO2 and the breathing, we already saw a buffer system that comes into play, but we also have just straight its own respiratory regulation. Okay, so the simple act of breathing can play an important role in maintaining the pH of body fluids, right? You got that increased carbon dioxide concentration in our body fluids, increases hydrogen ion concentration, and that lowers the pH. So because the bicarbonic acid can be eliminated by exhaling CO2, that's what is known as a volatile acid. Conversely, a decrease in the CO2 concentration of body fluids raises the pH. And this whole chemical reaction is what impacts our respiratory regulation. So changes in the rate of depth of breathing can obviously really impact this. It can alter the pH of body fluids with just a couple of minutes. So if you have increased breathing, what's going to occur is you have more CO2 that's being exhaled. And when CO2 levels decrease, the reaction is driven to the left-hand side where hydrogen ion concentration falls and the blood pH increases. Doubling the breathing increases pH by about 0.23 units. Okay, so from 7.4 to 7.63. If breathing is slower than normal, less carbon dioxide is exhaled. So when CO2 levels increase, the reaction is driven to the right and the hydrogen ion concentration increases, so blood pH decreases. Reducing breathing to just 1/4 of a normal, that lowers the pH by 0.4. So you go from 7.4 to 7. The pH of body fluids and the rate and depth of breathing, they interact via negative feedback loop. All right, there's always got to be some form of control. When the blood acidity increases, right, so we have a decrease in our pH, increased concentration of hydrogen ions, that gets detected by central chemoreceptors in our medulla oblongata and peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic and carotid bodies, both of which will stimulate the dorsal respiratory group in the medulla oblongata. So because of that, the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles contract more forcefully and more frequently. So more CO2 is exhaled. And as less carbonic acid forms and fewer hydrogen ions are present, blood pH increases. When the response brings blood pH back to normal, there is a return to acid-base homeostasis. So the same negative feedback loop operates at the blood level of CO2 increases. Breathing increases, removes more CO2, reduces hydrogen ion concentration, increasing the blood's pH. So it's almost kind of like they have this play on each other. If the CO2 increases, the response is going to be this way, but once it normalizes, the breathing will decrease, kind of keeping an increase and a decrease along the way to balance the teeter. So renal regulation, as you can expect, all based on the renal side of things. Metabolic reactions produce non-volatile acids such as sulfuric acid at a rate about 1 mil equivalent per day for every kilogram of your body mass. And the only way to eliminate this huge acid is to excrete hydrogen ions in our urine. Now, the magnitude of these contributions to acid-base balance, it's not surprising that renal failure can quickly cause death, right? And so, if you remember what we learned prior, in both the proximal convoluted tubules, the PCT, and the collecting ducts of the kidneys, they secrete hydrogen ions into our tubular fluid. And in the PCT, sodium hydrogen ion antiporters secrete hydrogen ions as they reabsorb sodium. Even more important for the regulation of pH of bodily fluids, however, are the interstellated cells of the collecting duct. The apical membranes of some interstellated cells include proton pumps, hydrogen ions, ATPases. These guys secrete hydrogen ions into tubular fluid. Interstellated cells, they can secrete hydrogen ions against a concentration gradient so effectively that urine can actually be up to 1,000 times more acidic than your blood. And bicarbonate ion produced by dissociation from that carbonic acid inside those interstellated cells cross the basolateral membrane by specific means of an antiporter, and it diffuses into our peritubular capillaries. The bicarbonate ion that enters the blood in this way is new, so it's not filtered. And for this reason, blood leaving the kidney in the renal vein may have a higher bicarbonate ion concentration than the blood that's entering the kidney in the renal artery. Now, a second type of interstellated cells has proton pumps in its basolateral membrane, and calcium bicarbonate ion antiporters in its apical membrane. These interstellated cells secrete bicarbonate ion and reabsorbs hydrogen ion. So the two types of interstellated cells really help maintain the pH of body fluids in two ways: by excreting our excess hydrogen ions when pH of body fluids is too low, and by excreting excess bicarbonate ions when our pH is too high. Some hydrogen ions secreted into the tubular fluid of the collecting duct is buffered, but not by bicarbonate, most of which has been filtered and reabsorbed. Two other buffers combine with hydrogen ions in those collecting ducts. The most plentiful buffer in the tubular fluid of the collecting duct is the monohydrogen phosphate ion, as well as a small amount of ammonia is present, and hydrogen ions combines with that phosphate to form dihydrogen phosphate ions, and with ammonium to form ammonium ion. Because these ions cannot diffuse back into tubular cells, this is how they get excreted in urine. They just go throughout the urine. So normal pH range of artery blood, right? 7.35 and 7.45, around that range. Things can go wrong. We can have what is known as acidosis or acidemia. That's a condition in which blood pH is below 7.35, or alkalosis, which is a condition in which blood pH is higher than 7.45. The major physiological effect of acidosis is the depression of our central nervous system through depression of synaptic transmission. If the systemic arterial blood pH falls below 7, depression of the nervous system, it's pretty severe. Okay, the individual becomes disoriented, can become comatose, and may even die. Okay, so patients with severe acidosis, they usually do, okay, while in a coma. A major physiological effect of the alkalosis, by contrast, is overexcitably in both the central nervous system and our peripheral nerves. So neurons conduct impulses repetitively, even when not stimulated by normal stimuli. And the results are more nervousness, muscle spasms, and again, convulsions and possible death. A change in blood pH that leads to acidosis or alkalosis may be countered by a couple ways. By compensation. The physiological response to an acid-base imbalance that acts to normalize arterial blood pH. Compensation can occur for either complete if pH indeed is brought within normal range, or partial if systemic blood pH is still lower than that or higher than what is expected. So if a person has altered blood pH due to metabolic causes like hyperventilation, hypoventilation, can also help bring blood pH back toward the normal range. And this form of compensation is what is termed the respiratory compensation. It occurs within a few minutes and reaches its maximum within a couple hours. If, however, a person has altered blood pH due to respiratory causes, then renal compensation, changes in secretion of hydrogen ions and reabsorption of the bicarbonate ion by the kidney tubules can actually help reverse the damage. Renal compensation may begin in minutes, but it does take a couple days to make a maximum effectiveness. So as you can see, anything that comes renal is going to take some time. Now, both respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis are disorders resulting from changes in the partial pressure of CO2 in systemic arterial blood. Now, by contrast, both metabolic acidosis and alkalosis are disorders resulting from changes in the bicarbonate ion concentration. Okay, so each have a role in two different things. Respiratory acidosis, very much the hallmark is that it's abnormally high in systemic arterial blood above 45 mercuries. Inadequate exhalation of CO2 causes the blood pH to drop. Any condition that decreases the movement of CO2 from the blood to the pulmonary alveoli of the lungs to the atmosphere, or breathing, causes the buildup of CO2, carbonic acid, hydrogen ion. Such conditions include pulmonary edemas, injury to the respiratory center, the medulla oblongata, airway obstructions, or possibly even disorders affecting the muscles that may play a role in breathing. If the respiratory problem is not too severe, okay, the kidneys can help raise the blood pH into the normal range, and that's all done by increasing excretion of hydrogen ions and reabsorption of the bicarbonate ion. That is your renal compensation. The goal in treatment of respiratory acidosis is to increase the exhalation of CO2, as for instance by providing ventilation therapy. Okay, sometimes in addition it can be IV administration of bicarbonate ion that can also help. Respiratory alkalosis is where systemic arterial blood falls below 35. The cause of the drop and the resulting increase in pH is hyperventilation, which occurs in conditions that stimulate the dorsal respiratory group in the brain. So oxygen deficiency, high altitude disease, pulmonary disease, stroke, anxiety. But again, as previous, renal compensation may be able to bring back the blood pH into a normal range if the kidneys are able to decrease the hydrogen ions and increase reabsorption of bicarbonate ions. And treatment of respiratory alkalosis is aimed at basically increasing the levels of CO2 in the body. Okay, and in cases where it's caused by severe anxiety, simple treatment is used. Okay, have that person inhale and exhale into a paper bag for a short period. Right? And that actually leads to the person inhaling air that contains higher than normal concentration of CO2. So it's basically increasing the CO2 levels circulating in the blood just by breathing into a brown paper bag. And that's why that is said to help with anxiety or panic attacks. Now, metabolic acidosis, this is where the systemic arterial blood bicarbonate ion levels drop below 22 milliequivalents per liter. So such a decline in this super important buffer causes the blood pH to decrease. Now, three situations may lower the blood level of this. Actual loss of bicarbonate ions, such as they can occur of severe diarrhea or renal dysfunction, accumulation of an acid other than carbonic acid, as made during ketosis, for instance, or failure of the kidneys to excrete hydrogen ions from metabolism of dietary proteins. Now, if the problem is not too severe, hyperventilation can help bring pH into the normal range. That's your respiratory compensation. You can also get more external treatment, I guess you can call. Treatment of metabolic acidosis can also be done by IV injections of sodium bicarbonate, okay, which can lead to correcting the cause of the acidosis. Now, on the flip side, alkalosis is when the bicarbonate concentration is above that 26 milliequivalent per liter. A non-respiratory loss of acid or excessive intake of alkaline drugs causes the blood pH to increase above that 7.45 as a consequence. So this is like excessive vomiting, gastric contents, all which can result in substantial loss of hydrochloric acid, and it's probably the most frequent case of metabolic alkalosis, which causes can include that gastric suctioning, diuretics, endocrine disorders, those alkaline drugs, so like antacids, severe dehydration, and respiratory compensation as well can happen again. It can help. And it's all by hypoventilation, which can bring the blood pH into the normal range. Treatment also can occur by fluid solutions, electrolyte solutions to correcting electrolyte deficiency, which may also be impacting alkalosis. Now, all of this obviously needs to be diagnosed. Okay, and the cause of the acid-base imbalance has to be known. It can often be pinpointed by just evaluating three factors: pH concentration of bicarbonate ion, and the value of bicarbonate ion, the pH value of bicarbonate ion, as well as the pH of the blood. Okay, all can be done by systemic arterial blood or just blood collection. Okay. Now, and the way this happens is obviously first thing you do, check the pH of the blood. Okay, if the pH is high, it's most likely direct to alkalosis. If it's low, it's acidosis. Now you have to decide which value. Bicarbonate is out of the normal range and it could be the cause of the pH change. So if we have elevated pH, it could be the cause by low or high bicarbonate ion. And if the cause is a change in hydrogen ions, the problem is respiratory, or sorry, in CO2, the problem is respiratory. If the cause is change of bicarbonate ion, the problem is metabolic. Okay, and as such, after this, you look at the value that doesn't correspond with the observed pH change. If it is within its normal range, there's no compensation. If it is outside the normal range, compensation is occurring and partially correcting the pH imbalance. So, for instance, looking at changes of the CO2. Is it a respiratory response compensation or is it not? Is there no fluctuation? So you're basically checking and balancing across the pH, what is elevated or decreased enough to cause a pH change, and of the other four compensation systems, or two compensation systems, what is changed in a way that could be helping with the pH changes to understand, is it respiratory? Is it metabolic? Is it acidosis? Is it alkalosis? Is there some form of compensation that's occurring? And which one is doing it? Now, with anything, obviously lifespan impacts it. Okay, there's huge differences between adults, infants, premature infants, and it's all really correlating with blood distribution, regulation of that fluid, and of course electrolyte balance, which all impacts acid base. So Accordingly, infants experience more problems than adults in these areas. And one, it's because of proportion of distribution of water. Okay, newborns' body mass is like 75% water, and prematures can be 90%. Whereas an adult, if we've seen before, it's 55 to 60%. Okay, so adults have twice as much water in our ICF as ECF, but the opposite is true because in premature infants. So because ECF is subject to more changes than ICF, rapid losses or gains of body water are much more critical in infants. So given that the rate of fluid intake output is about 7 times higher in infants than adults, and the slightest change in that fluid balance can really result in severe abnormalities. Next is metabolic rate. The metabolic rate of infants is double that of adults. Okay, it makes sense. They're developing, their organs are coming online in a sense, the body's coming online, so their metabolic rate is increased. Okay, double that of an adult. So because of this, in the production of more metabolic waste and acids, they can lead to development of acidosis in infants. Functional development of the kidneys in infant kidneys are only about half as efficient in concentrating urine as those of adults. Okay, so as a result, the kidneys of newborns can neither concentrate urine or rid the body of excess acids as effectively as those of adults. The ratio of the body surface area to body volume of infants can also impact it. It's about 3 times greater than that of adults. Water loss through the skin is significantly higher in infants than in adults, which can lead to changes in the body fluid. Breathing rate can also impact it. So the higher breathing rate of infants, that's like 30 to 80 times per minute, causes greater water loss from the lungs. Whereas respiratory alkalosis may occur because greater ventilation eliminates more of the carbon dioxide and it lowers the ion concentrations or the hydrogen ion concentrations. Ion concentrations, as newborns have higher potassium and chloride concentrations than adults. This creates a tendency towards more of our metabolic acidosis because of these changes. So, by comparison with children and younger adults, older adults often have an actually impaired ability to maintain fluid electrolytes and complete the acid base balance. Okay, so it's not just impacting all the infants. As you age, with increased age, many people have a decreased volume of intracellular fluid, decreased total body potassium. That's all because of declining skeletal muscle mass and increasing mass of adipose tissue. Okay, and that contains very little water. Age-related decrease in respiratory and renal functioning can also impact their acid-base balance because that's going to impact the ability to exhale and inhale CO2 and its ability to excrete or retain certain things to control the pH of the urine. Other kidney changes like decreased blood flow, decreased glomerular filtration rate, and reduced sensitivity antidiuretic hormone also have adverse effects on the ability to maintain fluid and electrolyte balance. But due to a decrease in number and efficiency of sweat glands, water loss from the skin declines with age, actually. So because of all of these age-related changes, older adults are susceptible to several fluid and electrolyte disorders as well, such as dehydration. Okay, that occurs due to our inadequate fluid, right, intake. So it leads to like a loss of more water than sodium and our vomit, feces, urine. Hyponatremia, which may occur due to an inadequate intake of sodium, elevated loss of sodium in urine, vomit or diarrhea, or impaired ability of the kidneys to produce our diluted urine. Hypothalemia, which often occurs in those older adults who chronically use laxatives to relieve constipation, or some that may even take some potassium depleting diuretic drugs for treatment of their hypertension or heart disease, and acidosis, which obviously we've seen it can occur due to impaired ability of lungs and kidneys to compensate for that imbalance of acid base. All right, now just remember, exam next week. Get it in by Friday at midnight.